Previously on this channel, I made a video assessing whether the Star Trek character Amanda Grayson was a good mother to Spock and his siblings. This time, I wanted to take a similar look at Spock's other parent, the Vulcan Sarek, and how good or not of a father he was to the 3 children he raised. Let's start with the child who came into Sarek's life first, Sybok. Sybok was born out of wedlock to a Vulcan princess named Terea in Star Trek novels, whom Sarek had apparently had an affair with. Since marriage is considered important in Vulcan culture, it can probably be assumed that children born out of wedlock would be ones conceived by accident. Sarek may not have even initially known that he'd gotten Terea pregnant. It seems that initially, Sarek let Sybok's mother raise him on her own, similar to what happened with James Kirk and Carol Marcus regarding their son David. Eventually, Terea died, presumably while Sybok was still a minor, because Sarek then took him in to be raised in his household alongside his other children. Naturally, Sarek would have taught Sybok the ways of Vulcan logic. Notably, however, Sybok rejected these customs, believing that self-realization was to be discovered through emotion as opposed to logic. Once Sybok became an adult, he was eventually banished from Vulcan and ended up in a rehabilitation center for Vulcans who had strayed from the path of logic. While Sybok was staying there, he had the alias Zavarius, presumably to protect Sarek's reputation. It's one thing to be a highly respected figure in society who had a child outside marriage, but to then have that child be banished from society is a whole other thing. So I can see why Sybok would be registered in the rehabilitation center under a different name. It isn't exactly clear whether Sybok wholly rejecting Vulcan logic had anything to do with Sarek. Based on what we know about Sarek and how he raised his other children, though, he most likely wouldn't have accepted Sybok's choices. All we know for sure is that he took in Sybok after Sybok's mother died, which was the responsible thing to do. However, it is implied that Sarek at some point disowned Sybok because he refers to his other 2 children as both of his children instead of 2 of his children. Now for the next child who came into his life, though not next in terms of age, his half-human son Spock, whom he had with his first wife, Amanda Grayson. Since Spock was being raised in Vulcan society, Sarek taught him the Vulcan way. Spock did inevitably have some human emotion which came from his mother's side, but Sarek was reportedly dismissive of it. Sarek was not even aware that Spock struggled with a condition similar to dyslexia, latokterai, which he had inherited from his mother's side, and that only she ever made any attempt to help him with it. As a boy, Spock would run away to the mountains alone for days at a time and would neither tell Sarek what he was doing nor listen to Sarek disciplining him over it. Spock once ran away from home to try and prove himself ready for the Vulcan coming-of-age Kazwan ritual in which children are sent to survive in the desert alone. Sarek does tell Spock that he doesn't have to do the Kazwan if Spock being half-human would make it too difficult for him, but having been taunted by his schoolmates for not being a true Vulcan, Spock wanted to take the matter into his own hands, unprepared as he would turn out to be for it. Sarek had intended for Spock to attend the Vulcan Science Academy once he became an adult. When Spock chose instead to attend Starfleet Academy, Sarek was very disappointed in him, and the 2 disagreed about the matter so strongly that they did not speak to each other for as many as 18 years. It was during this time that Spock was accused of murder, and Sarek believed that the best course of action was to turn him over to Section 31. Unlike Spock's mother and sister, Sarek did not have significant enough doubt that Spock would ever do such a thing to consider instead trying to prove his innocence. Once the matter was over with, Sarek continued keeping his distance from Spock at Spock's request. As an adult, Spock still felt some sense of shame about his human heritage, both the fact that he willingly entertained emotions such as friendly affection, and that he had rejected emotion to the point of never telling his human human mother that he loved her. Spock mentions his father directly upon revealing this information, strongly suggesting that Sarek played a part in Spock feeling divided between his human and Vulcan heritage. Although Sarek claims to appreciate humans and humanity, it's clear that he wanted Spock's Vulcan half to be more dominant in his behavior than his human half. When Spock and his father finally saw each other again at a diplomatic event while Spock was serving aboard the USS Enterprise, Sarek insisted that Amanda speak about Spock in a way that would ensure the respect of his peers, but this request did not seem to involve any significant consideration towards Spock as his son. Even when Spock took part in a risky medical procedure to save Sarek's life, Sarek did not consider it logical to thank him. Several years later, when Spock died, Sarek insisted on retrieving his body and Katra and bringing the two back together through the Faltor Pan ritual. When the refusion is successful, Sarek helps Spock regain his memory and, when Spock resumes his service in Starfleet, finally apologizes for the circumstances that initially estranged father and son from one another. Decades later, Sarek and Spock would have a falling out once again. When both were ambassadors, they disagreed over how to approach the situation regarding the Cardassians, which resulted in the two once again not speaking to each other for a prolonged period. When Sarek is suffering from Bendai syndrome, he audibly laments how he didn't feel free to express love to his son because it was not the Vulcan way. Spock is not aware that Sarek has died until Captain Jean-Luc Picard informs him in person after Spock has gone to Romulus, and Spock only comes to know how much his father truly loved him upon mind melding with Picard, who had previously melded with Sarek. Sarek seemingly insisted that Spock only ever present himself as Vulcan despite being half human, discouraging him from so much as acknowledging the emotions influenced by his human side. Sarek definitely could have been more accepting of Spock even slightly deviating from Sarek's rather rigid expectations of him. It was especially wrong of Sarek to react so negatively to Spock making his own life choices in joining Starfleet, and to seemingly only become more accepting of those choices once Spock died and came back to life. Now for the third of Sarek's children to come into his life, his human adoptive daughter, Michael Burnham. Michael was initially raised by her biological parents, Mike and Gabrielle Burnham, on Doctari Alpha, a joint human and Vulcan colony, presumably with about an equal population of both peoples. When her parents were killed, or at least there was every reason to believe that they were, Sarek and Amanda agreed to take her into their household to be raised alongside their biological son Spock and presumably later Sybok. Since Michael had previously lived among both humans and Vulcans on Doctari Alpha, Sarek and Amanda probably figured that they, a Vulcan and human couple, would be best fit to make her part of their family. Sarek was somewhat understanding of Michael displaying emotion, particularly with her being fully human and having suffered severe trauma at such a young age. However, he did insinuate that Michael's human heart was an issue, at least in her schooling at the Vulcan Learning Center. When the Learning Center was bombed by logic extremists and the child Michael was rendered medically dead, Sarek intervened with a ritual in which he used a mind meld and his own Katra to revive Michael, despite the procedure being rare and frowned upon. As a result, part of his Katra remained with Michael, giving the two a mental connection through which they could share sensations such as physical pain and feelings of being in danger, even across thousands of light years. When Michael graduated from the Vulcan Science Academy as a young adult, both she and Sarek were hopeful that she would get to join the Vulcan Expeditionary Group. When Sarek learned that her application was rejected, he went to the group director to discuss the situation. The Expeditionary Group director made him choose between his human ward and half-human, half-Vulcan son joining, and Sarek chose the latter, which turned out to be meaningless since Spock attended Starfleet Academy instead of the Vulcan Science Academy. Sarek was ashamed of having to make the choice between his two children in the first place, let alone that the choice he made didn't help either of them, to the point where he never told Michael about the situation, and she believed her own personal failure was at fault. When she later tried to use their Kotrick connection to get answers from Sarek, he rather violently attempted to kick her out of his mind and only admitted the truth to her when his life was in danger. Based on the fact that Sarek was reflecting upon this memory when he was near death, the event itself clearly had a significant impact on his life, being one of his biggest regrets. With Michael unable to join the expeditionary group, Sarek went instead to a Starfleet captain he knew from his diplomatic connections, Philippa Georgiou, to have Michael serve under her tutelage. Knowing how Philippa and Michael's life experiences were similar, Sarek saw Philippa as best fit to be a mentor to his ward, probably in the same way he saw himself and his wife as best fit to take her in when her parents died. It seems that Sarek's attempt to help Michael fit into Vulcan society worked almost a little too well, as she didn't seem to know what to do upon meeting Philippa, who was perhaps one of the only humans apart from her adoptive mother who was herself adapted to Vulcan society that Michael had interacted with in a long time. When the ship Michael was serving aboard, the USS Shenzhou, found itself in a standoff with several Klingon ships, Michael felt that she could turn to Sarek for advice on what to do. He told her of how Vulcans have historically handled such encounters by shooting first in order to gain the Klingons' respect enough for them to back off. Michael attempted to take the same approach, but when her captain didn't agree, Michael attempted mutiny and was sentenced to life in prison. When she is later able to redeem herself, Sarek goes from referring to her as his ward to his daughter. Later on, when he learns that Michael is going to the future with no way to return, Sarek joins his wife in saying goodbye to Michael. Michael thanks him for everything he taught her, and he apologizes for anything he may have done wrong by her. When Michael asks him to, he also agrees to look out for Spock while still remaining distant as Spock asked. The discrepancies in Sarek's regard towards Spock and Michael are rather apparent. He would seemingly excuse Michael showing emotion because she was fully human, but not Spock as he was only half human, and Sarek believed that as a half Vulcan, he should always suppress his emotions. Sarek disapproved of Spock joining Starfleet, yet had previously instigated Michael becoming part of Starfleet when the initial plan for her to become part of the Vulcan Expeditionary Group fell through. Spock and Michael would eventually find themselves not speaking to each other in a way that was similar to Spock not speaking with his father, though less severe, and the way Sarek treated them differently, both as children and when they became adults, likely played a part in that rift between them. As others have pointed out, Sarek may very well have had ulterior motives for adopting and raising Michael as he did, whether he was aware of that or not. Sarek marrying a human and having a child with her caused him to be met with disapproval from much of Vulcan society, to the point where he was considered a traitor. Adopting and raising Michael might have been a way for him to prove that if a full human could be fully integrated into Vulcan society from childhood, so could a half-human Vulcan child. At the same time, Sarek wanted Michael to teach Spock empathy, and he wanted Spock to teach her about Vulcan ideals. Sarek's desire to bring Michael into Vulcan society, and for her to be someone for Spock to relate to yet also learn from, could have influenced him to specifically adopt a human child who was older than Spock. This is very likely a reason that Sarek chose Spock to join the Vulcan Expeditionary Group instead of Michael, because Sarek intended everything she did to be the precursor for what he wanted Spock to do without being met with scrutiny from Vulcan society. Sarek may have even saved Michael's life with his Katra, partially because he felt guilty for putting her in that situation, if only to prove a point. It is rather telling that the director of the Vulcan Expeditionary Group refers to both Michael and Spock as Sarek's experiments. Sarek should have left the choice of which of his children would be allowed to join the expeditionary group to Spock and Michael themselves, trusting them to know what they wanted for themselves instead of what he wanted for them. Overall, was Sarek a good father, both in general and towards his individual children? No, Not especially. In each of the times he became a parent, it seems that he was not fully prepared for some of the things that fatherhood would entail, particularly when his children did not meet the expectations he had for them. Sarek does eventually come to regret his mistakes and attempts to own up to some of them in order to make amends with his children, but that doesn't erase the negative childhood experiences that his children had because of his actions, which they carried into their adulthood. Not everyone is meant to be a parent, and Sarek probably would have done better to either never have become one, or changed his behavior accordingly to be a better one. So what do you think? Do you believe Sarek was a good or bad father to his children, or somewhere in between? Good to some and not to others? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching this video. Be sure to watch my video about Amanda Grayson if you haven't already, as well as check out my other videos on Star Trek and plenty of other media too. Live long and prosper, and I'll see you next time.